for the British Association for Irish Studies, and also our chair for this evening's event, which I'm very much looking forward to. I mean, just as a sort of basic Zoom housekeeping, you're very much welcome to have your cameras on, but you may wish to turn them off to sort of collectively conserve bandwidth, just to kind of keep everything running smoothly. And obviously, unless you are one of our speakers, keep yourselves muted just for the moment. The main sort of welcome I have to do before we get into the event itself is just to kind of say hello to those of you who are members of the British Association for Irish Studies, and to welcome those of you who may not be. This event is a sort of representative one in terms of the work we as an association are trying to do at the moment, in the midst of COVID and the challenges it faces. We're trying to still keep kind of bringing everyone together and giving them access to the exciting scholarship and community that we're sort of fostering with BAYS. We have a number of events like this coming up, or one sort of remaining between now and Christmas, which is essentially our sort of BAYS Christmas party, but also a book launch and a sort of celebration of ongoing work in Irish studies. So if I can share a screen with you all quickly, if you're on the sort of events page that you booked this through, you'll also see that there's a forthcoming event on the 17th of December there at 7 o'clock, where we'll be launching, I think as it currently stands, 5 new kind of Irish studies titles covering history, culture, a range of topics. And that will be hosted by our very own Caroline McGuinness and Maggie Scull. So please do join us for that. And you can kind of, keep yourself cozy in the as the winter comes in. The other thing for those of you who are members of BAYS is that, as you'll probably be aware from emails you've received, we're in the midst of sort of council elections. So on our site, you'll be able to see the various sort of statements for different candidates for positions. All of our sort of major positions, I think, are running uncontested, but our council election, the kind of 11-member council, there are decisions to be made there. If you're a member, you will have received an email that looks like this. Try and ignore how shamefully full my inbox is of unread stuff, with a link through to the kind of voting portal. So keep an eye out for that. You may want to check your kind of junk folder, because that's certainly where mine wound up whenever it was emailed through to be by Maggie, who's been doing God's own work in getting the electoral process underway. We're certainly aiming to have results turned around kind of more quickly and with less collective anxiety than other recent major elections have done, and hopefully the results will prove less contentious. But with that housekeeping kind of out of the way, it falls to me to introduce this event, which is exploring the kind of implications of Brexit, what feels like about the 3rd or 4th collective headache we maybe are facing as a community this year, and we're thinking about its implications for kind of Irish identity and notions of Irish identity. And I think it's very kind of fitting that BAYS as an organisation is kind of holding an event like this. Our raison d'etre as a kind of association is very much to celebrate and to kind of bring together the Irish in Britain, and to kind of facilitate work that explores what it means to be Irish in Britain today, or to kind of occupy multiple identities within that. And we're going to hear from 2 speakers whose work directly sort of engages with these questions in new and exciting and very kind of contemporary and urgent ways. And I'm very glad for us to be able to do so. It's also lovely to, I know our speakers were both noting that members of their family were in the call or in the audience. So it's lovely to be kind of fostering a very real sense of kind of extended kind of Irish community through the event. In terms of format, what we're going to have are the two papers, both of which are about sort of 15 to 20 minutes in length. And then we'll have about roughly the same again, time-wise, for questions and kind of discussion. With the questions, if you could put those in the chat, that would be great. And we'll sort of gather those toward the end of the presentations, and I'll put those to our speakers, I think, and I think we'll probably do questions at the end after both have spoken, so that we can, you know, kind of see the areas of overlap and communication between the two presentations. So you know, please you know, have a think about what you would like to put to our two speakers. So yeah, in terms of introductions, it is my very great pleasure to introduce you our two speakers. I'll introduce sort of each in turn as the paper comes up. So first up, we're going to be hearing from Vikki Barry-Brown, who's a third-year PhD researcher in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Funded through a Leverhulme Doctoral Trust Scholarship on the interdisciplinary QMUL Mobile People Programme, Vikki's project examines identity, belonging and home in the context of English migration to Ireland since 1960, which you know, is an under-researched population of significant size, and it's very exciting to be able to hear from Vikki on the work she's doing in this regard. She described herself as a returnee to academia, having spent 12 years working in the charity and public sectors in campaign, policy and research roles, before undertaking a master's in social research at the University of Leeds. Her dissertation as part of that master's focused on Brexit Irish passport holders, which I think you know, is a sort of area of overlap with our other speaker this evening. And she says that her fascination with identity and belonging comes from being Irish and Scottish, but sounding English, and that she wishes she started a PhD sooner so that she could have spent less on therapy. And Vikki is going to be speaking to us this evening on being English, beating Brexit, becoming Irish, ? So yeah, Vikki, if you want to unmute yourself, fabulous, and I will spotlight you. Excellent.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, so can somebody give me a thumbs up? They can see a picture of a windy road with a. Excellent. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Niamh. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Boyz for this opportunity. What follows is an aspect of my research. I will say it is light on analysis because of where I currently am in the PhD process. So do view this as a snapshot, please, with more to come. So English people in Ireland form a significant but under-researched group, set within what Professor Mary Gilmartin has alluded to as a complex and entangled historical relationship between both countries. Research into immigration to Ireland has increased as more people from outside of the country have made it their home. And with this, who gets to be Irish takes on new meaning. Yet there's a relative absence within this research to migration to Ireland for English people and what it means to be English in Ireland and how English people who've moved to Ireland experience belonging and home. Through semi-structured interviewing, I've been asking participants to share their feelings, thoughts, experiences, and memories to understand how they experience belonging and forge connections and make a home. Now, I didn't set out to specifically research Brexit, but it was inevitable that it would come up in conversations. My research interviews took place between October 2019 and March 2020, which is part of the period that I like to refer to as the "have we Brexited? What's going on?" phase. So Brexit is not the main focus of my research, but I'm pleased to be talking about it today because it intersects with most of what I'm looking at, which includes identity and citizenship. So you might be wondering what I mean by English and also why English and not British. In answer to the first question, participants were asked to self-identify as English or part English. And this was complicated through recruitment when the newspaper kindly featured a call out for participants. But despite my stress on the wording, the paper used UK nationals instead of English. This did, however, start curious conversations with potential interviewees. And I ended up speaking to some people who had really mixed feelings about their Englishness, and these feelings were often linked to Brexit. Now, this slide, of course, is tongue-in-cheek, and most participants were aware of boundaries and geographies of the places that they had lived and live. In answer to the other question, why English and not British, I was quite surprised when people started asking this question. To me, the answer seemed quite obvious, but not obvious enough that I could easily answer it. For me, British has always seemed to be a strange label wrapped around a large number of very distinct people with a range of local, regional, and national identities. The anthropologist Kate Fox talks of England as a nation that might be reasonably expected to have a distinctive culture or character, and of Britain as a political construct comprised of several nations with different cultures. In terms of identity, various academics conducting research on English migration to Scotland and to Wales have found that English people can sometimes annoy other national groupings by not acknowledging these country identities, and that English people might be more likely to identify as British before English, whereas Scottish people might identify as Scottish over British. Englishness has been alluded to by various sources as the identity against which the other Celtic identities were and are defined, with England viewed as the historical invader and coloniser. Indeed, affinities between the so-called Celtic nations is frequently cited, and this is sometimes suggesting distance for these countries from colonial involvement in Ireland, although certainly people from Wales, Scotland and Ireland took part in and benefited from colonial projects. I'm interested in interrogating how the history and connections between England and Ireland affect English people living in Ireland now. So a bit about the research. I carried out 28 interviews with 32 people. The number difference accounts for 4 couples who were interviewed together. I've used pseudonyms for the people that I've talked about in presentations, so there's no real names except for my own. Pre-COVID, the plan had been to interview people from across the Republic of Ireland, and lots of wonderful people came forward to take part. But as many others have had to, I've had to restructure the project and work with what I managed to get across 2 field trips, which took me to counties Donegal, Sligo, Cork and Tipperary. The participants had moved between 1973 and 2018. They predominantly lived in rural or semi-rural areas, with just a handful in larger towns or cities. Participants' ages when they moved ranged between 6 and 68, the ages at the time of the interview between 30 and 83. Reasons for migrating included moving with an Irish partner, migrating for work, seeking the good life, retiring, or they were children and they had no choice. One participant came for a summer holiday 22 years previously and just didn't leave. So for some people, Brexit was a contributor or even a motivator for the move. One example of this was Robin, who was also one of the aforementioned people with a complex relationship to Englishness. Both of Robin's parents were Irish, and he'd spent holidays from a young age in the village where his mother came from. He bought a house there in 2005, and in 2016 took the decision to move there full time. You can see a quote from his interview here. In a similar position was Robert. He'd moved in 2015. His mother was Irish, and he'd moved into a cottage bought by his parents intended for their retirement. Unfortunately, they both passed away before they were able to move there. He felt that Brexit had, quote, brought out extremes of hatred and racism, and he doubted he would ever set foot in England again. Like others who had moved around the same time, he was financially affected by Brexit, with his pension exchange rate going, quote, down the toilet. This meant that he was living significantly more frugally than he was expecting to, but he was keen to stress that despite this, he felt his quality of life was far better than it had been in England. As well as being a contributory factor in those moving to Ireland, Brexit has impacted on the lives of those who've been in Ireland for many years. Diane moved to Ireland in the 1970s with her then partner, an Irish man who she met in London. She told me how in December last year, she thought it was time to switch her UK driving licence for an Irish one. She described having some time on her hands during a trip up to Cork City and thought she'd pop into the driving licence office. She ended up waiting for an hour and 45 minutes before getting to see an advisor. She was quite nervous. She told me that the advisor seemed quite a severe woman who asked her a lot of questions, accumulating with the exchange that you can see here, where she was categorically told that nobody knows what's going on. Gary, who moved to Ireland in 2013 through his work for a multinational company, told me what it was like for him, often being the only English person in the office at work. Gary voted Remain, but felt that this was something he had to constantly remind his colleagues of when they were discussing it. They often made him feel as though he was personally to blame for the Brexit result. He said that, quote, "I think almost every day for a year, somebody would make some comment about Brexit, you know, over lunch, over break, or whatever." He admitted that this was a little bit wearing. And as I mentioned towards the start, I conducted some interviews in County Donegal, and participants told me about the complexities of living close to a border. One participant, Lisa, who lives in Letterkenny, but works across the border in Derry, told me how over the years, these complexities were beginning to be ironed out, but that Brexit would set things back. She pointed to the Remain vote in Derry within the Foyle constituency, the result that you can see here on the slide. She attributed this result to the population's knowledge of what living on a border is like. She told me that the Leave results broke her heart. Brexit undoubtedly impinged on the identity of participants, and in some cases resulted in those moving to Ireland to take the decision to hide aspects of Englishness and instead present a different identity. I interviewed Stephen and Rebecca, who had been living in Kent prior to their move to County Cork. Rebecca was born and brought up in South Wales. She had Irish ancestry going back a few generations. Stephen was born in England, but moved to Wales age 6. They'd been living in England for many years prior to their Irish move, a move which was driven by Brexit. Stephen told me that Brexit had caused him to examine his identity, and he found that he wanted to remember, quote, more the Welsh part than the English part. Rebecca always considered herself to be Welsh, British, and European. Now, they told me that they made a calculated decision as they embarked on their move. They were staying temporarily in Wales right before migrating, and deciding that they wanted their new neighbours to know them as Welsh, they acquired a Welsh car sticker, as detailed in the dialogue in the slide. Stephen told me it worked well, but one day he was talking to a neighbour who said when he found out Stephen was Welsh, that he was worried he wouldn't be able to understand him, but said to him, "Do you know, your Welsh accent's really easy to understand." Stephen's wife, Rebecca, was furious about Brexit. Both of them felt as though they were having their European identity stolen from them, with Rebecca giving the impassioned monologue that you can see here. Interviewing another couple a few days later, Lewis and Suzanne, I related Stephen and Rebecca's story of Welshness. Lewis explained that he'd done the same. He'd been born in Buckinghamshire to a Welsh father and an English mother, emigrated to Canada in the 90s, and moved to Ireland with his English wife in 2015. When asked in Ireland, he described himself as Welsh, until later down the line, he took a DNA test, which to his surprise suggested not only was he of Irish ancestry, but also of the geographical area where he had settled. Lots of people told me that Irish citizenship was a way to hold on to Europeanness, and others spoke of ease of travel on an Irish passport. Participants often acknowledged the common travel area arrangements, but didn't seem entirely convinced that they would be protected by law. Talking about Brexit often led to the subject of acquiring or reaffirming Irish citizenship, or vice versa. Robin, who I talked about in the beginning, had held an Irish passport as a child and a teen. He was and is an Irish citizen by descent through his Irish parents. He told me that he allowed his Irish passport to lapse, he thought, around the time of the IRA bombing campaign in England. At that point in his life, he was living in Birmingham and was deeply affected by the cold shouldering his audibly Irish father received working in the city. He didn't acquire an Irish passport again until, quote, good old Brexit, and whilst he retains a UK passport, as you can see from the slide, it's being put to a rather different to intended use. Another participant, Angela, who moved to Ireland in 1979, spoke about how she was considering a citizenship application, stating, quote, what England is standing for now, I don't want to be associated with it. That whole Brexit and Boris and all the rest of it, you'd be embarrassed. Jenny had similar feelings. She came to Ireland on holiday in 1998 and never left. When we met, she told me that if I'd interviewed her prior to Brexit, her answers would have been very different. She wanted to distance herself from England. She felt embarrassed about being English and took the decision to apply for Irish citizenship. She said that she felt very fortunate that through Irish citizenship, she could remain European, but she also wanted to embrace being Irish. Some of her family members weren't very supportive. Her uncle accused her of being unpatriotic. She felt that she had a kind of duty to educate these family members, as you can see from this slide. Participants who had successfully applied for Irish citizenship told me quite excitedly about the citizenship ceremonies that they'd attended. This slide is a photograph of one in Kerry, and of course these sadly aren't happening at the moment. Participants William and Marion are in their 80s. They retired to West Cork in 1999. Having successfully applied for citizenship, William described the ceremony he attended, with the army band and the speaker, a retired justice minister, encouraging citizens to use their new voting eligibility in elections and referenda. Something that really struck William was how the speakers encouraged the new citizens to bring their culture to Ireland. He said, quote, "You know, it was nice that you're encouraged to not stop being Nigerian or not stop being Polish and not stop being English, if you like." William and Marion were conferred at separate ceremonies, and William teased Marion that unlike him, her cohort were not serenaded by the army band because they couldn't fit them on the stage. But of course, having Irish citizenship doesn't necessarily mean that you see yourself as Irish, and even if you do, other people might not. Diane, who we talked about earlier regarding the driving licence, said that an Irish friend of a friend told her, "You might have an Irish passport, but you'll always be English." Robin, who'd been regularly visiting the same village since being a child and owned a house there for over a decade before making the permanent move, described a long process of being accepted as Irish and as part of the community, something which was reinforced through being involved in local hobby groups and being seen to be supporting Ireland in rugby at the pub. This was rewarded, he felt, by being invited to hold positions of note within the community. But he still described what he felt was, quote, "this residual thing where you can't really be properly Irish because you've got an English accent." Jenny told me that she didn't know how she'd feel when she became an Irish citizen and was pleased to find out that she felt so proud that it, quote, "actually became an emotional thing, quite a really good thing to do." She said that she felt Irish, but others, like her English mother, disputed that she could be. I interviewed a number of people who'd moved to Ireland as children, a result of their parents making the decision to migrate. In some of these cases, the parent was a returned Irish migrant. For others, there was no prior Irish connection. Louise, now in her early 40s and a mother of two, moved to Ireland aged 11 with her parents and has no ancestral link to Ireland. She spent most of her life living in Ireland, but as she's never lost her English accent, she felt as though she could never publicly admit to feeling Irish, let alone be accepted as Irish by people in Ireland, as you can see from this excerpt here. Louise was part of a group of respondents who, having moved to Ireland as children, formed friendships, gone through school, and had children of their own, often felt more Irish than anything else, but couldn't afford or justify spending €1,000 to apply for Irish citizenship. It's worth remembering that as we hear of rising numbers of English people in Ireland applying for Irish citizenship, there'll also be many people who would love to be citizens but just don't have the finances to do so. Of course, any of you who are regular presentation givers will know the smug feeling of writing a presentation in good time and being all ready, only to find out on the morning of said presentation that a newspaper has put out a relevant article that you should probably at least mention. As some of you may have seen, this article appeared in the Irish Times today, and in it, there are claims that Brexit has emboldened an increasing comfort among Irish people in expressing anti-English sentiment. Now, I would not be as bold as to try and cover this entire topic in one slide. So what I will say is this: many participants experienced anti-English sentiment across their lives in Ireland, and it will be something I look into as I continue with my work. However, only a couple talked about experiencing hostility specifically related to Brexit. Robert told me that he posted online about how he was an Englishman living in West Cork, how much he loved it and hoped that things would remain harmonious post-Brexit. But to his dismay, he received abuse online. When I asked him what, he said, quote, "English chavs should F off out of West Cork, basically." Another participant, Lauren, is married to an Irish man and their children were all born and brought up in Ireland. She told me that her youngest son is, quote, extremely anti-English, something that she felt came in part from social media and Brexit hype. Lauren says, quote, he never used to comment on it at all until it all started. That would be the page that sticks, wouldn't it? Until it all started to break, meaning all the stories online. This interview took place around the time of the controversy surrounding the planned Royal Irish Constabulary commemoration, something which Lauren also felt her son was getting quite worked up about and feeding into his anti-English narrative. But for the most part, amongst the people I spoke to, plenty reported ribbing and joking over the never-ending Brexit news cycle, and participant Louise laughed as she told me, quote, it's just another excuse for people to go, oh, stupid English people. So unlike Brexit, I will complete a swift conclusion. As you can see, Brexit is pushing people in ways that they might not ever have considered had the referendum not have happened. Some are abandoning Englishness and embracing Irishness. Those who want to and can afford it have been able to use Irish citizenship as a way to salve their mourning of European identity. Some have faced hostility, others have felt embarrassment. People have undergone identity makeovers as they cross the Irish Sea. Others have found ways into local communities through friendships, sport, and good humour. I hope that I've given you all a bit of an insight into English people in Ireland and the impact that Brexit has had and is having on their lives. If you're interested in talking to me, please do ask a question or get in touch. I'd be delighted to hear from you, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was really fantastic, and as raised, yeah, I mean, all manner of questions and kind of resonant sentiments, or yeah, sort of found myself checking off things I'd sort of felt at various points in the last couple of years. Marvelous. Well, having sort of canvassed the experience of the English in Ireland, I suppose we're kind of going to continue that thread, but in a slightly sort of different geographical locale. Hold on, sorry, I'll take you off spot there. Being singled out. So our next speaker and our next paper is coming from Niamh Lear. So Niamh is a fourth-year ESRC funded PhD student whose research is focused on how the millennial second-generation Irish are negotiating their English and/or British and Irish identity in the context of Brexit. A passport-carrying member of the Irish diaspora herself, Niamh's interest in this topic has been lifelong, considering her upbringing in rural Bedfordshire without regular access to soda bread, which is a pain I've certainly felt since moving over to London, and the contrasting experiences of her relatives in West London. Research interests include the Irish diaspora, hybrid identities, migrant communities, Brexit, and transnational families. And her presentation this evening is wonderfully titled "Becoming Irish: Boyzone, Boris, and Brexit." And I'm very excited to see how this sort of trio of focuses combine. So Niamh, over to you. I think you're currently muted.
There we go. Can we hear?
There we go. Fab.
Lovely. Right. Can everyone see my presentation?
We can, and it looks queer fancy.
Okay. Right. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today, I'm going to be trying to do half as good a job as Vicki's just done, talking to you about Irish identity in the second generation in London, specifically in this Brexit period, which I know is a wobbly and ongoing situation, but we'll talk about that as well. I'm aware that some of you here will have seen me speak about my PhD research before in the Hierarchies of Irishness talk that I did for the summer conference. It's linked to my Twitter page for anyone who's not seen it, a little shameless self-promotion there. Although I spoke a lot about passport paddies, contested identities, and the way in which Irish identity is policed contemporarily, I didn't give much context about the work that I'm doing. So we'll start with that, and then I'll move on to discuss how the millennial second generation have historically formed and felt about their Irish and/or British and/or English identity. Very complex because my participants identified in all sorts of different ways. before looking at how Brexit has affected the way in which my participants have identified after Brexit and the effect it's had on their citizenship. I'm going to be arguing that Brexit is repoliticising the second generation Irish identity. And so I'll spend a while trying to convince you of that and then finish off and we'll open up to questions, I hope. So in terms of my research, let me move over so you can still see me. I wanted my PhD to look at how Brexit would affect the identity construction and expression of a population that I had researched before, the millennial second generation Irish living in London. I conducted 29 interviews with individuals based in the London area who are entitled to an Irish passport under the current citizenship laws of the Republic of Ireland. In practice, everyone I spoke to was a child of at least one Irish immigrant, and so would be considered second generation, although some had two parents, some had one and then a parent from England, Scotland or Wales, and one participant had an American Irish mother. I had no participants with exclusively Northern Irish heritage. Although two participants did have a parent from the North, they also had a parent from the Republic. I think it's important to note, as the experience of Brexit of those of Northern Irish descent has additional layers of complexity. And although I briefly touched upon them, I think there's a whole PhD project or a postdoc for Vicki if she's interested in there, so I won't claim to be able to speak to that experience. My interviews were originally meant to coincide with St. Patrick's Day and the approach to Brexit on the 29th of March 2019. But as Vicki has already alluded to, that went out the window pretty quickly. And I ended up collecting my data between May and October of 2019. The motivation for focusing on the second generation was multiple. Firstly, it's a population that I myself am a part of, and therefore I'm really interested in other people's perspectives on their identity. Secondly, they're forming the bulk of this so-called rush for passports as a result of Brexit. And thirdly, just the nature of the Irish population in Britain. The Irish-born population in Britain is a declining group. It's about 250,000 down from its peak, which was in the early 1960s. It's an aging population, and as this handy graph shows, migration from Ireland to the UK, this data is based off census data, so it is UK, not Britain, is reducing, arguably because of Brexit. If you look where there's a little crossover, it's around 2015, 2016 when the announcement of the referendum was. Historically, however, migration has increased with economic downturns, so the next few years could see this situation change slightly or reverse. Either way, to me, this makes a focus on the second generation more pertinent, particularly given the push in engagement from the Irish government towards the global Irish through their diaspora strategy, which I'm sure you'll have seen in the news and online this week. The focus on millennials was mainly driven by this idea of this being the post-Troubles generation. That is, that they are largely unaffected by the Troubles, unlike previous generations of London Irish. Spoiler alert, I completely disagree with that assertion, but that's how I narrowed down my participant calls. I was specifically interested in those under the age of 18 when the Belfast Agreement was signed in 1998, so births from 1980 up to 2000. Again, the year 2000 picked specifically as those born in 2000 were ineligible to vote in the 2016 EU membership referendum. Participants had birth dates between 1983 and 1999, so the age range of my participants was 19 to 35 at the time that the interviews were conducted. So thinking about identity. In terms of national identity construction, there's loads of different theories, Hobsbawm, Gellner, Billig, Edinson, to name a few. In my opinion, all of these fall short in terms of conceptualizing the complex nuances of identity construction in the second generation Irish and people with more hybridized identities more generally. In a way, they're not really fit for purpose in a world in which people are more likely to have multiple national identities or affiliations and multiple citizenships. National identity and citizenship are distinct categories, but in general conversation they get confused. For example, when I asked participants what their national identity was and why, the majority responded with X because I hold that passport, which demonstrates this conflation and the importance of the passport as a symbol of identity, and that's something that we'll come back to later. I think elements of these conceptualizations are really valuable, however, particularly this idea of the everyday performance of identity. So Most participants touched on these sorts of everyday factors when they were reflecting on what made them feel Irish. Sports, food, music, school, friends. This excerpt from Lorraine, who later told me that she would consider getting an Irish passport, but she did feel guilty claiming Irishness as, and I quote, "It's not really fair on people who are actually Irish." And Lorraine talks about all of these sorts of things. She was living in London at the time of the interview, was actually born in Luton, an area which has historically had a large Irish population, and indeed is the hometown of Tommy Robinson and the EDL, Tommy Robinson also being of second generation Irish identity. And her experience was growing up was by her tellings very Irish. And yet she felt guilty about claiming this Irishness, as by her mind it belonged more to other people than to her. I think this demonstrates the complexities of having this sort of hybridized identity of two countries with complex colonial histories, and having an identity which you are therefore consistently justifying and defending, and it accurately demonstrates the failings of many of the ways that we currently conceptualize identity formation. This next quotation from a participant called Paul, I think further encapsulates this idea. Paul and his brother, who I also interviewed, their parents are from Kerry and Donegal, but they themselves were born in London. And they both carry British passports currently. Paul was considering applying for an Irish passport, depending on how Brexit played out. So we can only imagine he's still trying to decide. Here he speaks to the multifaceted nature of his experience of being London Irish. Paul and his brother were both pretty sporty and often use sporting references as touchstones for their Irishness. Roy Keane, Damien Duff came up, added Mick McCarthy, and other big Irish names from the late 1990s and first decade of the noughties. And here comes the Boyzone bit that I know you've all been waiting for. So, throughout my interviews, participants were consistently using references from popular culture to explain their identities. References ranged from Derry Girls, which is obviously slightly more contemporary, to the Keanes, Oasis, Dermot O'Leary, Patrick Kilty, Sonia O'Sullivan, and obviously Boyzone. These explanations were not just for my benefit. I'm younger than Daisy, and I'm more of a Westlife girl personally, probably because of my generation. But they were the prism that they were perceiving their Irishness to be viewed by outsiders. I'm Irish like Boyzone. Boyzone here represent the cultural touchstone that Daisy is using for others to understand what her Irishness means or has meant. For this millennial generation that I'm looking at, this was arguably a softer cultural touchstone than for the second generation in the 1970s and the 1980s, who at the height of the Troubles may have been more likely to suggest Brian Keenan than Ronan Keating. O'Sullivan draws on work on cultural avenue and argues that boy bands were used as somewhat of a nationalist tool, nationalist sort of advertising post-Troubles Celtic Tiger Ireland, clean, happy, harmonious, ripe for investment, a stark counter to what was advertised in Britain through the 1970s and 80s in the height of the Troubles. Whilst participants were in no way ignorant of the Troubles, indeed it was a point of frustration for many with regards to Brexit. The fact that this is the culture that is referenced most often by my participants also goes some way to explaining the romanticised views that they have of Ireland and the Irish political situation. On to Brexit. Now, there's a lot of discussion out there at the moment with regards to the motivations to applying for Irish citizenship. The individuals that I spoke to had either applied for an Irish passport in the wake of Brexit or who were considering doing so were on the whole acutely aware of the links that people were drawing between them, their applications for passport, and degradations of Irishness that people like Grantham have previously discussed. Although some people mentioned the practical benefits of retaining EU rights, like the freedom of movement, it wasn't the sole motivation for any of my participants. Jack, who's quoted on the screen currently, emphasised how Brexit had meant that his Europeanness was now threatened, and this made him not want to be English. He described how previously it hadn't really mattered what his identity was, the status of both the countries as EU member states, lessening the importance of which side of his identity his citizenship fell on. And this was a sentiment echoed by a number of my participants. Attachment to Europe is not so much pragmatic in this sense, but more an emotional attachment to a part of his identity that was unquestioned previously. Jack had for 28 years been a British passport holder and hadn't really considered applying for an Irish one before Brexit, but applied for one very soon after the referendum in order to hold on to his European identity. Rob, he gives another reason behind the decision that some participants took to apply for an Irish passport after the referendum. Although initially his motivation was that of a pragmatic one, his girlfriend had recently moved to Germany and he felt retaining his freedom of movement was a priority. The quote that you see from him here is him reflecting on that decision. Our conversation here was initially around acts of racial discrimination that he had been witness to in the wake of Brexit, which he felt Brexit had encouraged. Quite a few participants expressed similar worries and concerns about this, drawing parallels between the treatment that their parents and relatives had experienced in the 1970s and 80s and the attitudes that they were witnessing now. This was pretty uncomfortable for many participants. Their invisibility and the invisibility of the Irish as a migrant population in Britain, due to the comparative palatability and the integration of Irishness, meant that they felt complicit in these actions, which were affecting people from other EU member states, and that they were being misidentified as belonging or being a non-migrant population. And this is something that they wanted to distance themselves from. Distance from Brexit and what it has come to represent was probably the most cited factor in people identifying or choosing to identify as Irish post-Brexit. Brexit has become inescapable for people with English accents. And I heard many participant stories about people misaffiliating them with the Leave vote, something which only one of my participants voted for, or admitted to voting for, and was also experienced with some of Vicki's participants in the talk we've just heard. This ties in really nicely with some of the other work that Vicki earlier drew on, in the sense that although Britain is a political union of multiple identities, it often gets defaulted to Englishness and the priorities of England as a nation. This is definitely the case with Brexit. Brexit arguably is a symptom of British or English exceptionalism and toxic British or English nationalism, depending on your political affiliation, and was actually only voted for by England and Wales, not Scotland or Northern Ireland. Yet people from all of these nations are affected by this decision and the negative connotations that it has in other parts of Europe. Sally, who's quoted on screen, she applied for Irish passport in 2018, and the trip to Italy that she's describing here was her first using her Irish passport. I found this idea of her facing her passport outwards, visibly identifying herself as not British, interesting, particularly as on reflection, I can see times where I have done a similar thing. It also takes us back to the importance of the passport as a symbol of national identity. Although a symbol of citizenship, Sally is using her passport to distance herself from British Boris voters, an identity that she doesn't affiliate with, and one which British citizenship has come to somewhat represent. Not only is her passport a visual cue of her identity, but when we consider how contested the Irish identity is for many people in the second generation London Irish, who largely speak with English accents and who have their identities challenged often by other Irish citizens, their passport is a legal document. They have legal entitlement to it, and it's a physical embodiment of their identity, which is far more difficult to contest. And this was, again, seen in different ways through many of my participants. The last few quotations, I hope, have sort of brought in this idea of Irishness in the second generation being a political statement. Mentions of Boris, Brexit, and how these things are coming to represent British people more broadly in the context of the seemingly never-ending negotiations are clearly motivators behind applications for Irish passports. And for those with Irish passports outwardly expressing an Irish identity. For them, it's less about being Irish and more about not aligning themselves with the political identity that is currently synonymous in many ways with Britain on the global stage. In the first part of this talk, I spoke about how boy bands, Irish presenters and sports people softened the perceptions of Ireland in the 1990s and the early noughties, the period through which my participants were growing up. Their citizenship and their identities were in many ways inconsequential, a stark comparison to the second generation coming of age during the height of the Troubles, when their choice of passport had political ramifications. Growing up through these years when it didn't matter, and now being launched into a world where it does, choosing to express an Irish identity, whether that be in tandem with Irish citizenship or not, is once again a political statement. I think it's important here to consider as well the political environment in Ireland in recent years. Participants brought up the abortion and same-sex marriage referendums, the fact that Ireland had a gay immigrant Taoiseach, all of which can be read as progressive, particularly when in tandem with the political goings-on in the UK at the time, when I was doing my research. And by no means saying that Ireland is truly more progressive or even more left-leaning than Britain. Remember here the romanticisation of Ireland that the Irish diaspora as a whole is often guilty of. But I hope you can see how side by side, choosing a passport becomes less about your rights and more about what you stand for politically. To conclude then, although these images are very simplistic and this idea of Boris versus Boyzone is somewhat comical in some senses, this is what the Irish versus British passport has come down to represent for the millennial second generation Irish. These individuals have grown up in a post-Troubles world. Although their lives and the way they negotiate their families and friends is anything but post-Troubles, their status as English accented Irish people or Irish people with British blood or English or British people of Irish heritage is incompatible. Irishness as we know it today has developed out of Irish nationalism, itself in resistance to Britishness, and so that identities are somewhat inharmonious, hence the prevalence of terms such as London or Tyneside Irish, as opposed to English Irish. Brexit then has posed a set of issues that are new to them, but not necessarily new to the second generation Irish experience. Brexit, with its talk of sovereignty, taking back control, and the ignorance to the shared history of Ireland and Britain that has been shown throughout the Leave campaign and the subsequent Brexit negotiations, has unnerving parallels with the schools of thought behind British imperialism that the Irish Free State developed in resistance to. Although the situation is of course different, and I'm in no way trying to undermine or downplay the trauma of the Northern Irish conflict, people of Irish descent choosing an Irish identity or citizenship in Brexit Britain are in many ways facing the same decision those in second generation were facing 40 years ago, a decision that is inherently political and being used as such. Many thanks to the British Association for Irish Studies for asking me to participate in this, and I think that's me done.
Fab, yeah.